Okay, watch this magic.
All right.
And it didn't go 16 slides. Now I have to teach another class just so I can get to use this thing that I have in mind. Which brings up a point. In the summer, first week in June, they're going to ask all the elders to teach lessons on different psalms in the auditorium. And so, because I'm lucky, I get to be the first one and teach on Psalm 1. That's 6 verses that I was, as I read before this class, trying to figure out what do I do with 6 classes for a Wednesday night class. So we're going to have a discussion in the auditorium, thankfully. So all I got to do is make it 25 minutes worth of interesting, and then you all can amuse each other in the discussion groups. But that's what we'll be doing all summer long in the auditorium. Most people say if I wanted to discuss with somebody, I'd go to a coffee shop or go to McDonald's. I can talk to people there all night long. So do come. I think it'll be interesting. But we're going to start tonight. It says Luke chapter 19. I'm going to have to apologize to you. There were 2 or 3 slides that I didn't get to last week, and I'm going to skip those. I'm going to talk about chapters 19 through 23, and we're going to kind of compare the significance, the literary significance of some of these chapters in Luke. And we're going to be looking at some of the parables. So, it's slow. There we go. So Luke does differ from the other Gospels in a number of different ways. And I'm going to go through these first several pretty quickly just to bring up some points, so then we'll get into looking at the parables. First of all, the other Gospels focus on either a Jewish context or a Gentile context. Luke is not necessarily trying to focus on one or the other, but a lot of his teachings, in fact, emphasize an inclusive nature of Jesus' teachings. It's inclusive for the Jews as well as the Gentiles. He does portray Jesus as a savior of all people, regardless of social status, ethnicity, or background. You know that from as we look at the stories in the different chapters, that they talk about tax collectors, and can you name some others before I run down the list?
The lady that was caught in adultery.
Yeah. So we have higher echelon people like the tax collector, who's up in the hierarchy of not Roman society, but the Jewish society. You have the woman, and regardless of the background, and I'm going to allude to this a little bit later. Particularly at that time in society, terms like honor and shame were very important. If we look at some of the parables later, we're going to see that it's like the prodigal son. What was he dealing with when he was in with the pigs? I mean, how did he feel?
He was ashamed.
He was ashamed. Shame is one of the things that you're going to see throughout Luke. And honor. People who are honored versus those who are not honored. Do you remember the story where Jesus, or the rich man, the rich man was going to have a dinner, and he invited people to go, he said, go out and find people and invite them to come in. I don't know if you remember very much about that story, but in that parable, he said, don't just invite the people who are capable of holding a dinner and are able to invite others in. Invite the people in who don't have that societal level. And he divided it. I mean, I guess we do that in some ways. How do we, I guess, I'm not a social butterfly, so I don't know. How do we rank people socially? Okay, I'll give you an example. The realtor came and talked to us at our son's house to come and to try and sell a house. The first thing I wanted to do was see what kind of car he drove up in, because that tells you a little bit about him. If he's a realtor and he's driving a Hyundai Accent, you know, little bitty car, that tells me something. And I shouldn't say this because it sounds shallow. This man walked in and he was like this tall. I had to look up to him to talk to him. And he was like this wide, and it went down to a waist. It was like 28 inches, and it was all solid muscle. And he shook hands with me, and I went, eesh. So I said, wow, you must work out. He said, yeah, I've actually won a lot of awards as a bodybuilder. And I went, okay. I mean, now what do you think that told me about him?
He's a worker.
He's a worker. He had to stick to it. You don't get to be a bodybuilder overnight, or I would be one. You know, I don't last so much. So we do the same thing with the social status, or we deal with ethnicity or background. And Luke wants to make sure that, number one, he traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam. He wants to emphasize his role as a savior in this world. And he talks about that. Secondly, he has a kind of a meticulous approach. He's very orderly. As we compare, if we were to compare the books, he made it a point, and we talked about this before, he made it a point to say, as Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem, as he approached Bethpage, then he would say, then he told these stories. The other books arrange the parables and the incidences. Most of the parables are bunched into one little section, and it's almost like they're saying Jesus gave all these parables all at one setting. There are 1,000 people, and it all happened in one glorious day or something. It's all bunched together. But he ties it together, and he's very, not only meticulous, but with his description, his choice of words, how he lays out things. It's, as people study it, it's very scholarly, and it's comprehensive, and it's wasn't I was trying to think in the Chosen, which of those characters it was and how they portrayed him. But Luke is a physician, right? And as a physician, he would be one that would really pay attention to those kinds of things. He highlighted Jesus' interactions with those people that were marginalized, women who, an outcast. He shows a genuine interest in people from all walks of life. He's painting very vividly a picture of Jesus as somebody that is, he could be here and he could be lording it over you, but he didn't judge. He didn't exclude. Jesus was very inclusive in how he handled the people. He didn't say, well, he's just a tax collector, so I'm not gonna go to his house. So, very quickly, we looked at 19. Chapter 19 talks about his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and he pays a lot of attention to the crowd's response and how it reflected their expectations of a Messiah. So we have at the very beginning him coming in, and then one of the main stories that everybody remembers from there is the story about Zacchaeus. In Luke 20, his authority is questioned. It starts off with a debate between the Jesus and the religious leaders. And you know this, that you've read the story, heard the stories in sermons. They try and trap him by asking him special questions. And even at least once, he gives them an answer and they go, we can't respond to that. So they shut up and just go away for a minute. But they're ultimately going to come back. And throughout this, the start of Luke's story, from the very beginning to the end, he shares these parables, and the two here in this particular chapter that stand out are the vineyard owner and the wicked tenants. You know, the ones who, are you familiar with that parable? The man who owned all the land, and he had the tenants, and he sent people to get the money that he was owed. They got beat up, and everybody he sent got beat up. And so
Then he sends his son.
what?
Then he sends his son.
Yeah, then he sends his
kill
son, which almost as an allegory, the son is going to represent Jesus. We're going to talk about allegories a little bit later. In 21, this is where Jesus predicts the temple's destruction, and he starts speaking about the end times. He paints a picture, but they can't even begin to really understand what's going to happen. If you read the history books about when Jerusalem was besieged and literally wiped down to the ground, they killed babies and children, and it was really terrible carnage. And he was trying to warn them about that. He was telling them they're going to have to endure a lot, and they're going to have to trust that God, amid all this stuff, is still in control. He's still sovereign. 22. This is a pivotal chapter talking about the Last Supper. And by the way, if you don't know, there's in scholarly circles, there's a lot of discussion about whether this is a Passover feast or whether it's a Last Supper that he's having with them. And if you study very much about it, there's going to be page after page after page of each side trying to prove. I shouldn't say trying to prove it.
Seemed like there was some passage where the disciples asked Jesus about where we eat the Passover. Where are we going to eat the Passover?
Yeah, they were. That is a part of it, and that was brought up. But there are other things when they discuss it that say, look, this could have been the Last Supper that they had together before they got into the Passover time period. And that's where they draw that distinction. And I'm just letting you know, I'll be honest with you, I don't care whether it was a Passover feast or whether it was the Last Supper the day before or what it was. All I know is that Jesus was there with the disciples, and to me that's what's important. I'm not going to quibble over a lot of that. If you really want to get academic about it, we got a whole Bible department over there that would love to take your money and discuss it with you. Okay, and you've read this already about Judas and the Mount of Olives, and it's setting the stage for his arrest, crucifixion, and death. And 23 is the one of the key chapters that everything is leading up to. Like I said, there it's the culmination of God's redemptive plan. Now, in 23, this is where we start talking about the compassionate nature. And I put it in blue there. His forgiveness of those who crucified him exemplifies divine love triumphing over human sinfulness. The Old Testament all leads up to this culminating point. And you know this, you've sat through enough sermons that you've been told how important everything that happened in the Old Testament is to establish who Jesus is and what he was here for. And then the New Testament church, us, we look back at that as a central moment in history. Now, I want to talk about the parables now a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question. And if you can't think of one, let me know. I'm going to check these off. Tell me a parable that stands out in your mind. Out of all the parables, what are the famous ones?
Prodigal son.
The prodigal son. Okay,
For me.
I got that right here.
Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan.
Mhm.
Any others?
Tares.
The tares.
Lost coin.
Lost coin, lost son, lost sheep. All those are kind of grouped together.
Okay. I don't know if you know this or not, but Luke has 11 parables that are not in any of the other gospel books. When I read these to you, I think most of you will say, yes. Because I even asked my wife, who really studies a lot, and I'm impressed with her Bible knowledge, but I said, where can you find this? And I was waiting for her to say, well, in Matthew, or, whatever. And she happened to pick the one that was right. That's right. Okay, the two debtors is one, or one is where they forgave a large debt and then went to get a smaller debt from somebody else and threw the guy in prison. That's only in Luke. The Good Samaritan, we mentioned, again, only in Luke. And this is a parable. Both of these are a parable of forgiveness and compassion. And we'll come back to the Good Samaritan thing in a minute. Do you remember the parable of the man who went to his neighbor's house at midnight?
Asking for bread.
Yeah.
For a visitor.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of questions. We're going to go back to what we were talking about before. How many of you would be happy if somebody came in midnight and pounded on your door and said, I need food for some people that are coming to my house, whatever? Most of you are shaking your head no. That's what we have dogs for, right? Open the door. Now, but that time, going back to this, the culture then is different than the culture now. They were obligated. People generally felt an obligation. In our society today, we don't generally feel an obligation in situations like that. And we can go off on a long discussion about that. If he's talking about somebody who's persistent, I really need, what would you think that parable would be about? Why would they tell a story about a guy coming to get some food at midnight? If you were sitting in the crowd, what would you get out of that? I got an idea. I'm going to open up a United.
To pray and not give up.
To pray and not give up. Very good, Mr. Good. Now, are all the stories are those parables the kind of thing that we can read and say, well, this is about the church, or this is about the, right?
The kingdom or something.
Now, if it were only like an allegory, then it might be that way, that the character represents Jesus, or the character represents something else. Kelly's heard this before, I apologize. We just talked about the prodigal son. What's the point of that story?
That the father forgives a wayward son.
Forgiveness?
A repentant son.
Who's the father supposed to represent?
God.
Okay. Who's the prodigal son supposed to represent? Don't say me.
Us.
Us. Okay. Do you know that in other countries, based on their culture, they perceive in that story that the point is more about God watching over them? Because in that story, if you'll remember, the story starts out with a famine. And there's a famine that's mentioned in it. In other countries, in Africa and other places where they have famines, they want to know that God's going to be there to take care of them. And they see it from a different perspective. They base it on that famine thing, not the prodigal son and the honor shame thing. The honor shame thing in some cultures is important, as it would be in Jerusalem at the time of Israel. Here's another one, just mention these. The unrighteous manager, that's in Luke chapter 16. It's a shrewd manager who emphasizes wise stewardship and faithfulness, taking care of what you've been given. The rich man and Lazarus, the fate of a rich man and the beggar named Lazarus after death, the unjust judge. Again, this might be a prayer thing. I like that parable personally. Do you know what the story is of that parable? Of the judge and the widow who keeps coming to him? She keeps coming and coming, and he says, I gotta get rid of this woman. Okay, tell me what you want. Let's get this over with. Get out of here. Now, that persistence we attribute to prayer again. That we gotta keep asking. Because what do we do in our society? We ask once, maybe twice, and then we either say, well, he's obviously not gonna answer, so I'm giving up, because you don't get your answer immediately, or whatever our phrases on that. And the Pharisee and the tax collector, those 11 parables are not in any other book. How do you define a parable? What's your definition of a parable? An earthly story
The heavenly
of the heavenly being. I can't tell you how many times when I was working with the youth in classes, we'd have to say that to them over and over again. Okay. I'm going to read a quote to you. A man by the name of C.H. Dodd asked, was all the wealth of loving observation and imaginative rendering of nature and common life used merely to adorn moral generalities? Now what he's saying is, were all of the parables only talking about things in general life in order to lead you to these generalities to a more specific point? And The answer probably is, I don't think so. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of these things right now. I'm sorry I'm quoting all these people. It said, the ancient Near Eastern mindset conceived of life in narrative frameworks, unlike our North American culture in which stories often serve to highlight concepts. A man by the name of Kenneth Bailey said that he imagines that if Jesus had been a Westerner, his style of communication would have been radically different. Now, how many times, and I've done this frequently in classes, listen to a student who say, I don't understand this, thous and wasts and hath and all those words. I don't understand all this. It's hard to understand that Bible. And because of that, and I'm old enough to know this was back in like the 50s or 60s. What do we have now to compensate for that cultural inability to understand that language? We have the Message, we have translations and versions that try and simplify all that and put it in everyday language for now. And in Luke chapter 9, verse 58, Jesus says, foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. You want to hear what that would probably sound like in today? Try this. It's easy for us to try and imagine what he would say now, and I'm not trying to make fun. But more than likely, it would come out with something like this. Bold statements are easy to make, but you have to consider seriously what it will cost you to follow me. It seems evident that so far you have yet to want to follow me. I must say to you plainly that I can offer you no salary or security. If my point is not yet clear, perhaps an illustration will help. For example, I don't even have a bed of my own to sleep on. And that's how they would take that and turn it into a modern day language thing. So, and I had to get English teacher on you, is a parable just simply a metaphor for something else? Is it only a metaphor, a comparison? Like this is like this. Don't you think it has to go beyond that? So what is a parable? Could it be, do you know what an allegory is? Nobody?
Remember, it's been a long time since we sat in an English class.
Yeah.
I know. Well, an allegory is generally, you have, like in Pilgrim's Pride, you have a character and his name might be Christian. And so, who's he supposed to represent? All Christians. And so, you have, in an allegory, definite characters who, and whatever they do there is supposed to be that representation of. So on one hand, you're representing. On a metaphor, what you're doing is you're comparing. You're just saying this is like this. Okay. So could any of these parables be more than that? Remember, we're talking about the literary work of Luke now. We could read these. I'm going to go off on a tangent again. I won't mention the name of the church, but we went to this church one time, and where we lived, and we got it for class. We got into. They said, "Let's open the Bible to Matthew," and they would say, "Okay, let's read verse 1," and then they go around the room and say, "What does that mean to you? What do you get out of that verse?" And then they say, "Okay, now verse 2, what does that mean to you?" And it didn't take me long before I figured out that was a pooling of ignorance. I mean, there was not a lot of substance to that. They didn't look at it in context. They didn't realize that what happened in the chapter before may actually have significance and meaning for what's happening in the next. And none of them for sure knew that all those numbers and chapter divisions and everything else were not biblical. They were man-made. They were put in there just so we could try and draw some sense out of all that. So, it's more than that, but yet at the same time, they're written in such a way to be a tease to the people. I don't know if you like riddles or not, but that's kind of what it was for the people. They would, this pronouncement would come out and they'd go, oh, what does that mean? It is not unlike listening to Trump where you say, what does that mean? Because he's not making sense to begin with. These make sense, but they're trying to, and it's a tease. The parables were meant to be a literary tease in a way. It was common, but you notice Jesus never took the time, I shouldn't say never, he generally did not take the time to say, I just told you this. Now, let me explain to you, you dummies, what I was just saying. He didn't do that. He left them to figure that out.
Or we let them to ask him.
Right, to
Whatever.
entice them to ask, or entice them to talk to each other, and try and figure that out. What did that actually mean? Now that brings up another problem. Can you outline the story of the Good Samaritan for him? Okay.
These two guys were on a trip, and the first one was attacked by robbers and robbed of everything and left for dead. And the Samaritan comes, several others come by before the Samaritan did, and they avoided him because all the religious ones did, because he's unclean. Especially if he's dead, they can't be anywhere near him, so they just pass it off. The Good Samaritan comes along, tends to his wounds, takes him to a nearby city, sets him up in a lodge, and pays for his care, and promises that when he comes back through finishing up his trip, if there's any balance due, he'll pay that. And so it's somebody taking care of somebody else that they find that needs some help.
Okay. If we were talking allegory, or if we have a tendency in our society and to want to assign things, what would the Samaritan be to us? How would we make application to that? If it was is it just a metaphor? Like, life is like this, you're gonna get beat up, but somebody's gonna come along to save you. How many of you believe that? You got beat up on the streets of Lubbock, that somebody would come by and say, and take care of all your bills.
I think it kind of goes back to love your neighbor,
Okay.
love one another. And Samaritans were not accepted by Jews,
Now, see,
but here he is doing what the Jews wouldn't do.
I have actually heard sermons where they said, that Samaritan is like you. We're supposed to save people, and we're supposed to get them to the church. No, the inn. We're supposed to bring them into the church, the inn. And we're supposed to save them, heal them, and take care of them. Have you ever, does that ring true with you? My point is, when we're looking at these parables, who's to say what the inn represents? Who's to say in any of the other parables, like if you're given a golden ring, what that represents? Or who's the judge? That has to be, is the judge God, and the widow is just all of us who have to pray to him all the time and just hope that he gets really, really disgusted with us and answers our prayer? Is that how God works? Is that really supposed to represent God? Because I'm not sure I want a God like that. That says, all right, shut up already. I'll answer your demands. Just go away. Who decides all that? So the parables have to be more than just some literary device. Go ahead.
In James, it talks about praying to God for wisdom, and it says God is going to not condemn us, or he's not going to judge us for asking for wisdom. Whereas in the scenario you just gave, it was just like shut up.
Yeah.
Like God, according to James, God is not like that.
Yeah. Exactly. So when we're reading these parables, there is I shouldn't say juxtaposition, but there's seems to be a conflict sometimes when you read something here and then you try and apply it and make sense to one of the parables, it doesn't ring true.
Maybe it depends on what you're asking for.
Yeah, well, that's true. Under what is the text saying? Again, I'm going to read something to you. No, I think I can say it. I'm going to read it. I don't want to say it wrong. Imagine an Englishman telling a story about the days of King Arthur and his court. The listeners would subconsciously throw what Bailey calls an invisible mental switch. He says, everyone knows how the characters are expected to act in the world of the Knights in the Round Table. Sir Lancelot will respect the ladies, obey the king, and so forth. Imagine then an Englishman telling the same story about Sir Lancelot to an Alaskan Eskimo. Would the Alaskan Eskimo sit there and identify with that story about Sir Lancelot? Not unless they're very well read. They're not going to. It's not part of their worldview. We have a lot of people that probably in the church that have trouble with the whole concept of king or lord. We've never had to walk around and say Lord to anybody. In fact, most of us think we're the lords. And, everybody should be bowing down to us, is how our society
I
works.
think the kingdom of God is a democracy.
Yeah, and it's not. So probably the point there is that when it comes to a lot of these stories, we are the Eskimos. We're sitting there trying to read these parables, and we want to read into it our culture. Just like I said in other parts of the world with the famine, they say, during the famine, God was with us. He saw us through that. He protected us through the famine. And we don't ever pick up on that. In fact, most of you aren't even sure to this minute whether the word famine is even part of that story. I'll bet. You say, I don't remember that being in that story. How many of you don't remember that? I don't think you do. Go look it up. Now, so all these interpretations are something that we need to consider, and Luke does a good job of taking the world views and trying to paint them in a good light. I've already talked about the shame and honor thing. I was going to give you an example about that. Two examples, actually. I don't know if you've traveled overseas. You did. You went to Vietnam. When I was sent to Southeast Asia, they shuttled me off to Thailand. They literally, when we got off the plane, took us into a room and said, here are some things you need to know. You cannot put your feet up on a table facing someone. you cannot ever put your feet higher than someone. Why?
Show of disrespect,
Show of disrespect.
dishonor.
I mean, that means they are lower than the dirt on your shoes. It's a tremendous insult. And we had to learn that. I mean, you know how a lot of people sit at their chair, put their feet up on the desk? That was a no-no. You didn't do that. If there were any Thai personnel around. So we as Americans say, well, that's stupid. You know, why would we? No, but it is a tremendous dishonorable thing. Another true story real quick. Okay, when I was teaching in Kahoma, the principal called all the teachers together in the auditorium, and he was irate. I mean, mad beyond mad. Somebody had done something that just really set him off. And he wanted to know who it was, and we weren't going to go home until he found out, and he was going to clean somebody's clock. Well, we had this art teacher who, his first year there, he was from Hawaii, had long hair, he taught art, and he was real bohemian. He was just kind of out there. And he stood up and he said, I did it. I'm sorry. And you could hear the principal yelling at him all the way down the hallway as everybody in the auditorium skittered out, trying to not be a part of the collateral damage. The next day we said, why would you do that? We know it wasn't you. Why would you do that? And he said, the principal wanted to yell at somebody. The guy didn't want to get yelled at. I don't care. I've got wide shoulders. And he said, I probably won't even be here next year. And he said, everybody's happy. And that's how he handled the thing. And we were all going, I don't know, I'd have the guts to do that. And he said, that guy didn't want to be shamed. He probably did the mistake accidentally or something. And he said, he didn't want to be called out on the carpet. But the other guy wanted to show his power, his authority. So it was a win-win for everybody. And so a lot of these parables, and when we talk about what's happening with the text and things, you have to understand that the cultural norms that we're referring to are certainly different here than they would be there. Would somebody go to Luke 14, and we're going to read 2 verses 12 through 14.
Before we go there, I want to read a passage to you, okay?
Okay.
After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. Okay, now that's from the NIV. Okay, I'm not sure if it's in other versions. I think it probably is, but that confirms that there was a famine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in our culture, in our society, we read that story. And preachers get up there with wherever they get their information, and nobody ever mentions, they gloss over that famine thing. In fact, I'd be willing to bet I could ask half of the ministers on the staff if there's a famine in that story, and they'd say no, because we tend to overlook stuff like that because it's not part of who we are. And so the whole thing with what's going on there. Okay, who has Luke 14:12 through 14?
Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
Okay. So I wanted to read that. I talked about it earlier, but I wanted to make sure you read that part where don't invite people who can invite you back. And surely the people who are listening to that are gonna say, why? Why would he say that? And then when he says, invite the people who are, and has all the list of problems, because you're gonna get your reward some other time. Now, is it possible in that story that we wanna read it that way, the way we interpret it generally, because it makes sense to us that way? Might the people listening to it from that culture see it from a different way? For instance, the common people, the ones who's mentioned at the end of that parable, how far down on the rung of hierarchy of importance, economic stature, where were they? They were below the dirt on the person's shoe, right? Like in Thailand. To them, that took on a whole different significance. Now, when they looked at the top part of that, the people who can invite you back, or all the other criteria that he listed prior to that, what was the point of that? Why didn't he just say, I'm a generous person. I want to have a dinner, and I want to invite only the poor people. That says one thing, but what's the first part of it say? What do we attribute that to? What kind of? We know who it is. It's meant to be all those people that you invited me, so now I gotta invite you, and, right? That play those kind of games.
Well, and it goes back, I think, a verse earlier, when Jesus says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And then he goes into verse 12 and he says, then Jesus said to his host, and then tells that story.
Yeah.
So I think those are connected together.
Okay. You just got into a couple pages.
Well, I was looking at your notes before class.
But I'll bring that up right now. All of the parables in Luke, if you look at all the parables, they all have an introductory phrase like that. And then Jesus, what did you say, turned to his host.
Yeah, he said to his host.
Said to his host. Or there's some introductory phrase at the beginning of all the parables that are not seen as much, if at all, in the other parables in the other books. Because they were just I shouldn't say but they put the parables all lumped them together. He's telling it as part of a story. And he wants to say, he did this. And then, because isn't that how we tell stories? We say, well, I'm going to go back to my teacher days. And then the student was doing this and this. And then the principal came in. And nothing happened because he's ineffective. Now, I wanted to see if you caught on to that. Okay. But he always has those phrases. Okay. 25 minutes, so I'll get to a lot of this. A man by the name of Bernard Brandon Scott defined a parable as a mashal, M-A-S-H-A-L, that employs a short narrative fiction to reference a transcendent symbol. As an obvious definition of Scott's thought, Jesus' parables are highly complex literary forms. In Hebrew, the word mashal is the equivalent of parable. It's a short story. And just like when we write short stories, I shouldn't say this, if you ever tried to tell a whole story in a short story form, it's hard to get all the information in there and pack it in there and still have the impact that you want, because most of us read novels and they take pages and pages and pages to describe how somebody walks into the room. And you're going, all right, I got it. So, N.T. Wright says, if Jesus had openly declared what he frequently told in cryptic stories, a riot or a lynching would have been in order. If he actually came out and said what they wanted to say, what he wanted to say, people would be offended. But he gave them time to think about it and translate it. And he couldn't be pinned down. If he came down and said, well, those priests and those Roman officials, they're all a bunch of whatever, yada yada, and they're all gonna go to hell, and you people, on the other hand, they hang him. Just the same way they say, what gives you the authority to say that you're the Son of God? What gives you the authority to preach this way? They wanted to pin him on something. So the parables were a very effective way to paint a picture, to tell a story, and yet at the same time, not have it be so pointed that they could nail him for something. Does that make sense? So it's a different way of looking at the things literarily. Again, I'll read. Jesus' parable about two boys and their dealings with their father was not about the rewards and trials of parenting, but about something else. The story refers to something else. Jesus' parables, however, reference what Bailey calls theological motifs. And the parables were allegories as such, and they weren't exactly metaphors on every level. But he created a word called theogloris. Theologoris. So it's part of stories and theology. So it's like theology. It's too late tonight. And so when we look at these, most of, and we don't have time to get into this, Jonah would get into great detail about this. When you look at those parables, you need to understand, we're looking at from an English standpoint, written for our culture, our time, our language. Whereas when you look at the parables in the Hebrew, if you look at the parables in light of how they told stories, very quickly, do we have any, can you think of anything either in your family or in the cultures that we're surrounded with immediately here where storytelling is an important thing?
Grandkids listening and sitting at the feet of their grandparents and hearing their experiences in their life and the lessons that can come from that.
I would say American Indians, storytelling is an important aspect of their culture. And the same thing, you know, where the father comes back from war, never says a word about it, but his brother is talking to that man's son and says, you don't know this about your dad, but here's what he did. And it changes the guy's perception entirely. And so these stories that are being told that are kind of cryptic, and we tend to want to make them metaphors. We want to tend to make them allegories or whatever, but they're more than that. Those stories are very intricately planned. You can imagine Jesus knew exactly what he's saying. He didn't want to say any more or any less than he had to. He said exactly what was important. So the parables are one of the main aspects of what we see in Luke that is handled differently than the other books. Questions? Say you have
Do y'all remember when Baghdad fell and they pulled down that big bronze statue of Saddam Hussein? What did his people do to that statue to show their disgust and dishonor for him? They took off their shoes and were hitting that statue with their shoes as they were dragging it down the street.
And you know, they told stories to their grandchildren.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I was there.
Yeah, I was there. I wore my sandal out on
I
that
was
thing.
hitting him. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I just wanted to touch on that to make you aware of it. I mean, obviously, if you wanna really study, there's classes you can take, and there's so much more detail. All those books that, Jonah had, I had the majority of them also. And if you want to read something that you'll go, I read that paragraph 4 times and I'm still trying to. There's some really academic stuff out there. I'll be glad to if you want to get into it. When you have nothing else in your life to do. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you.